David Walsh checked his gear one last time before the transport beam activated. A knife, water filter, emergency beacon, and shelter tarp. That was everything the Galactic Council allowed for this competition. Around him, 4 other beings did the same, though their appendages and methods varied wildly. The reptilian creature to his left, a Srath named Gorvan, flexed his clawed hands and grinned with too many teeth. His scales gleamed under the artificial lights of the staging area. He had been bragging for the past hour about how his species evolved in environments far harsher than this test planet. Natural armor, he called it. Built-in weapons. Superior strength. On the opposite side, an insectoid clique named Rithan cleaned her compound eyes with thin forearms. She had been quieter, but David had overheard her talking to her people through the communication device before it was confiscated. Something about her species surviving on countless worlds, adapting faster than any mammal or reptile could dream. The amphibious Droon, Moss by name, kept his skin moist with a spray bottle until the last possible moment. He looked nervous, which surprised David. The Droon were supposedly expert hunters on their water-rich homeworld. Maybe he was worried about the temperature swings mentioned in the briefing. The crystalline being called Prism stood perfectly still, light refracting through her geometric body. The Loomis rarely participated in physical competitions. Prism had volunteered as a scholar, interested in testing her species' adaptation abilities outside their standard environment. She communicated through a translation device that made her sound like wind chimes. David said nothing during their posturing. He simply listened and watched. That was his way. 30 years as a wilderness survival instructor back on Earth had taught him that observation mattered more than boasting. People who talked too much about their skills usually lacked them. The transport coordinator, a floating jellyfish-like creature, announced the final countdown. Holographic screens around the staging area showed millions of viewers across the galaxy tuning in. This survival challenge happened once every 10 cycles, and species took it seriously. It was entertainment, sure, but it was also proof of capability. Civilizations had gained or lost respect based on their competitors' performance. 5 different zones on planet Tau 7 had been prepared. Each zone contained similar resources and challenges, but the competitors would face them alone. No contact except for scheduled check-ins every 3 days. The rules were simple. Survive 30 days using only what nature provided and what you could make with your own hands and the basic tools given. Use the emergency beacon and you were disqualified. Die and, well, that was also disqualification. Though the organizers had medical teams on standby, the beam activated. David's stomach lurched as reality shifted around him. One moment he stood in the clean, controlled staging area. The next he materialized in a forest. The smell hit him first. Earth vegetation, something floral but alien. The air was humid and warm. David took a slow breath, centering himself. He had trained for disorientation during transport. First rule after arrival: assess immediate threats before anything else. He turned in a slow circle. Dense forest surrounded him on all sides. The trees resembled bamboo but thicker, with purple-tinged bark. Their canopy filtered greenish sunlight, creating dappled shadows on the forest floor. Undergrowth was moderate, not too thick. Good for movement. The ground sloped gently downward to his right, suggesting water flow. He could hear it now, a river or stream somewhere close. No immediate predators visible, no obvious dangers. The air temperature was comfortable now, but the briefing had mentioned night temperatures could drop significantly. The planet's day cycle was roughly 26 Earth hours. David knelt and touched the soil, slightly acidic judging by the smell, rich in organic matter. Good for plant growth. He noted the insect life, small creatures moving through the leaf litter. Where there were insects, there were usually things that ate insects, which meant a food chain he could potentially tap into. He spotted his landing marker, a small beacon the organizers had placed to mark the center of his zone. A 5-kilometer radius from this point was his territory. Leave it and risk disqualification. David pulled out his tarp and laid it flat. Organization first. He emptied his pockets, taking stock of everything. The knife was decent quality. Fixed blade, about 6 inches. The water filter was a standard portable unit, good for several hundred liters if maintained properly. The emergency beacon he wrapped carefully in a corner of the tarp. He would not need it. The sound of water drew him. David moved downslope, careful to mark his path by bending small branches in a consistent pattern. Getting lost on day 1 would be embarrassing. The forest opened up after 50 meters, revealing a clear river about 20 meters wide. The water moved at a steady pace, not too fast, not stagnant. Perfect. David knelt by the bank and examined the water. Clear, which meant either very clean or very mineral heavy. He would filter it either way. Small fish-like creatures darted in the shallows. Aquatic plants grew along the edges. He spotted what looked like clay deposits on the far bank where the river had cut into a small cliff face. His mind was already working through possibilities. Shelter near the water but elevated above flood level. The clay could be useful for pottery. Those bamboo-like trees would make excellent building material. The river provided transportation, food, water, and a natural landmark. David walked upstream for 10 minutes studying the terrain. He found what he was looking for. A natural terrace about 3 meters above the river, flat ground with good drainage, backed by denser forest that would provide wind protection. Several large trees grew there, perfect for anchoring a structure. He returned to his landing point and retrieved his gear. The sun was past its zenith, which gave him maybe 12 hours of daylight to work with if this planet's day was similar to the briefing. Not enough time to build everything, but enough to start smart. David selected 4 trees in a rough square on his chosen terrace. He used his knife to cut saplings and branches, working methodically. Speed mattered less than precision right now. A poorly built shelter would waste more time than careful initial construction. By the time the greenish sun touched the horizon, David had a basic frame erected. He had lashed the bamboo-like poles together using strips of bark that peeled easily from dead trees. The structure was elevated half a meter off the ground on a platform, which would keep him dry and away from ground-dwelling creatures. His tarp formed a waterproof roof with proper angles for rain runoff. It was not comfortable yet, but it was functional. More importantly, it was a foundation. David sat by a small fire he had started using friction and dry tinder. The night sounds of the forest rose around him. Something howled in the distance. Smaller creatures rustled in the undergrowth. The river gurgled its constant song. He chewed on a strip of jerky he had found in his pocket, probably left there from his last hiking trip before this competition. He would need real food tomorrow, but tonight he would rest and plan. The stars emerged overhead, unfamiliar constellations in an alien sky. Somewhere out there, millions of beings were watching him through remote cameras. Gorvin was probably hunting with his claws. Rethan was likely digging a burrow. Moss was finding the dampest spot available. Prism was doing whatever crystalline beings did to rest. David added another branch to his fire and smiled. Let them survive. He was going to do something better. He was going to live well. The challenge was not just 30 days in the wilderness. The real challenge was maintaining humanity, even when stripped of civilization, and David Walsh intended to prove that humans did not just endure harsh conditions, they transformed them. He closed his eyes and listened to the night, already planning day 2. Day 2 began with David doing something that would have confused the other competitors. He sat still for an entire hour. Not sleeping, not resting from exhaustion, but watching. He observed which direction the morning sun came from, how the mist rose from the river, where animals went to drink, and which plants the local herbivores avoided. The camera drones hovered at a distance nearly invisible. David ignored them. Somewhere in the galaxy, viewers were probably complaining about the boring human who just sat there. Let them complain. Information was more valuable than action right now. After his observation period, David began work on water collection. The river provided plenty, but hauling water multiple times daily wasted energy. He cut sections of the thick bamboo-like trees, each segment naturally divided by internal walls. With careful cutting, these became tubes. He positioned them to catch rainwater from his shelter's roof, funneling it into a large segment he buried partially in the ground to keep it cool. The work took most of the morning. When the first check-in came on day 3, the coordinator seemed surprised to find David healthy and calm. Through the holographic display, Gorvin appeared with mud covering his scales and visible scratches on his arms. He had been fighting with local predators, apparently. Rethan looked tired, her compound eyes slightly dulled. Moss seemed fine but complained about the temperature drops at night. Prism was silent, her crystalline surface already showing small cracks from environmental stress. David reported his status in simple terms: stable, healthy, shelter secure. The coordinator's tentacles quivered with what might have been confusion. Most competitors were supposed to struggle in the first week. After the check-in, David crossed the river at a shallow point and collected clay from the deposits he had spotted. He formed simple bowls and pots, then fired them in his campfire overnight using techniques humans had used for thousands of years. They were crude but functional. Now he could boil water without wasting his portable filter, cook food properly, and store supplies. Day 5 brought the storm. Dark clouds rolled in with surprising speed and rain hammered down in sheets. Wind bent the trees and turned the river choppy. David sat comfortably in his elevated shelter, watching the chaos. His roof held perfectly, angled to shed water. His fire pit, which he had lined with stones and given a partial cover, stayed lit. He had even created a small channel to divert runoff away from his platform. Through gaps in the rain, he saw the camera drone struggling against the wind. He wondered how the others were doing. The answer came at the next check-in. Gorvin's shelter had partially collapsed. He was soaked and angry, blaming the unnatural weather. Rithin had flooded out of her burrow and lost several days of food stores. Moss had fared better, being adapted to water, but even he looked miserable. Prism had taken shelter in a cave but seemed dimmer, her light refraction less vibrant. David's report was again simple. No issues. The coordinator asked him directly how he had weathered the storm so well. David explained about roof angles, drainage, and elevated construction. The coordinator's translation device made a sound that might have been a sigh. After the check-in ended, David noticed the view counter on the holographic display before it disappeared. His feed had 10 times more viewers than it had on day 1. Apparently word was spreading. With his shelter secure and water handled, David turned his attention to food sustainability. Hunting was fine for immediate needs, but it burned calories and time. Instead, he created a fish trap using woven branches, placing it in the river shallows. He identified edible plants through careful testing, small tastes followed by waiting periods to check for reactions. Several turned out to be not just safe but actually pleasant. Near his camp, David cleared a small area and transplanted some of these useful plants. A garden was thinking ahead, something that seemed beyond the survival mindset of his competitors. But David was not just trying to survive until day 30. He was building something. The smoking rack came next. He had caught several fish and a rabbit-like creature in his traps, more than he could eat immediately. Waste was inefficient. David built a frame and used smoke from green wood to preserve the meat. In 3 days, he would have supplies that could last a week or more. Day 7 marked the end of the first week. David had lost no weight, unlike the others. His clothes were still relatively clean because he had built a separate area for messy tasks like cleaning fish or working with clay. His shelter now had a proper door made of woven branches and a window that could be covered or opened depending on weather. That evening, he sat on a log he had positioned as a bench, eating smoked fish with some edible tubers he had roasted in the coals. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. The alien stars would emerge soon. David thought about his competitors. They were all capable in their own ways. Gorvin was strong and fierce. Rethin was quick and clever. Moss was an excellent hunter. Prism had knowledge that David could barely comprehend, but they were all focused on endurance, gritting teeth and pushing through until day 30 arrived and freed them from this ordeal. That was the difference. They saw this as an ordeal. David saw it as a challenge to maintain his humanity. Humans had not conquered Earth by simply enduring its harshness. They had changed their environment to suit their needs. Fire, shelter, tools, agriculture. These were not cheating. These were what made humans human. The cameras watched him eat his meal in relative comfort. Somewhere out there, billions of beings were starting to realize that the human approach to survival was fundamentally different. Not better or worse necessarily, just different. Where other species adapted themselves to the environment, humans adapted the environment to themselves. David added another piece of wood to his fire and considered his next projects. He needed better tools. The single knife was limiting. He could knap stone into basic blades and scrapers. He had spotted flint-like rocks near the river. Tomorrow he would make an axe and a proper digging tool. After that, furniture. A table would be nice, and a better sleeping platform with some kind of padding. The ground was acceptable but far from comfortable. David had spotted plants with fibrous leaves that might work for weaving a mat or even a primitive mattress. Then there was the matter of hygiene. A week in the wilderness and he was starting to feel grimy despite his best efforts. Soap was possible. He had animal fat from his catches and wood ash from his fire. The chemistry was simple enough if he could get the proportions right. David lay back on his shelter platform and looked up at his tarp roof. 30 days. He was 1 week in and already living better than some people did on frontier colonies. By the end of this, he intended to be living better than some people did in cities. The night sounds rolled over his camp. David smiled and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another day of building, not just surviving but thriving. He would show the galaxy what humans did when given a challenge. They turned wilderness into home. The stone axe changed everything. David had spent most of day 8 working on it, carefully selecting a hard rock and shaping it through pecking with another stone. He hafted it to a sturdy branch using cordage made from plant fibers and sealed the connection with pine-like resin. The result was crude by modern standards but effective. With the axe, he could process wood faster. Larger logs became building material instead of obstacles. David expanded his shelter, adding a covered porch area where he could work during rain. He built a proper frame for his fire pit with a stone chimney that drew smoke up and away instead of letting it linger. The improvement was immediate. No more stinging eyes, better temperature control, and he could actually cook without everything tasting like smoke. Day 9 brought pottery success. His earlier attempts had been functional but ugly and prone to cracking. This batch, fired longer and with better clay from deeper deposits, produced containers that could hold liquids without seeping. David made cups, bowls, and a large jar for water storage. He even attempted a plate, which came out slightly warped but usable. The look on the coordinator's face during the Day 9 check-in was worth capturing. The floating jellyfish creature's translator device made a series of confused chirps when it saw David's camp. Behind David, clearly visible, were organized shelves made of wood, pottery neatly stacked, a smoking rack filled with preserved food, and what could only be described as furniture. Gorvin appeared on his section of the holographic display. The Srath warrior's scales were dull, his movement sluggish. He had been burning too many calories on aggressive hunting and not enough on shelter. When he saw David's setup, his vertical pupils narrowed to slits. He said something in his own language that the translator politely converted to impressive resourcefulness, but the tone suggested less charitable thoughts. Rethan asked David a direct question. How much time was he spending on these constructions versus finding food? David explained his trap system and preserved food stores. He spent maybe 2 hours a day on food-related tasks now. The rest was improvement and maintenance. Rethan's antennae drooped. She was still spending most of her day searching for meals. Moss actually laughed, a burbling sound through his throat sac. He admitted the human approach was clever, though he claimed Droon preferred simplicity. The subtext was clear. He had not thought of doing these things himself and was too proud to admit it. Prism remained silent, but her crystalline surface seemed to pulse with what might have been thoughtful consideration. After the check-in, David began his next project, a bathing area. He was tired of feeling dirty. The river was cold even during the day, and bathing in it meant being vulnerable to whatever lived in the water. Instead, David dug a depression near his camp and lined it with clay, creating a watertight basin. He positioned it where morning sun would hit directly. The system was simple. Fill the basin with river water in the morning. Let the sun warm it through the day. By evening, he had a warm bath waiting. He even made a crude soap from rendered fat and wood ash, mixing them in careful ratios and letting the mixture cure. The first batch was too harsh, stripping skin like sandpaper. The second batch was better, still rough but functional. On day 11, David bathed for the first time since arriving. The warm water, even the crude soap, made him feel human again. He washed his clothes too, hanging them on a line to dry in the sun. The camera drones captured everything, and David could only imagine the reactions across the galaxy. His camp continued to evolve. David built a proper table using flat stones for the surface and log supports. He made a chair by weaving flexible branches into a frame and padding it with dried grass contained in a woven cover. It was not a recliner, but it was infinitely better than sitting on logs or the ground. The sleeping platform got an upgrade too. David gathered soft plant materials, dried them thoroughly to prevent mold, and sewed them into a mattress cover using plant fiber thread and a needle made from bone. The result was lumpy and far from perfect, but it beat sleeping on bare wood. Day 12 brought an unexpected visitor. Rithan appeared at the edge of his camp, moving cautiously. David had heard her approaching, of course. It was hard to move silently through a forest when you had 6 legs. He stood and greeted her calmly. Rithan's compound eyes fixed on his camp, taking in every detail. She clicked her mandibles in what might have been amazement. Through her translator, she asked if she could observe his methods. David agreed without hesitation. He showed her the fish traps, explained the pottery firing process, and demonstrated how he tested plants for edibility. Rithan was quiet for a long time after the tour. Then she admitted something David had not expected. Her people were primarily scavengers and tunnel builders. They were excellent at using existing structures but less skilled at creating from nothing. She had been struggling because she kept waiting to find the right natural shelter instead of building one. David offered her some smoked fish and a cup of clean water. They sat at his table, an insect and a human sharing a meal on an alien world. Rithan asked if the competition allowed such sharing. David pointed out that the rules said nothing about prohibiting it. They were supposed to survive using their own skills and the environment. Helping another competitor was not against the rules, just unexpected. After Rithan left, David noticed his viewer count had doubled again. Apparently, the galactic audience enjoyed the interaction. Or perhaps they were just fascinated by the human who had turned a survival challenge into something resembling hospitality. Day 15 arrived, marking the halfway point. During the check-in, the coordinator seemed to have given up on understanding David's approach. It simply recorded his status: healthy, well-fed, comfortable. The contrast with the other competitors was striking. Gorvin had lost visible body mass. Moss had a persistent cough. Prism's cracks had spread and she moved slowly. Only Rithan seemed improved, though she was still clearly struggling compared to David. The coordinator mentioned that David's camp had become the most watched feed in the challenge's history. Viewership had exceeded previous records by orders of magnitude. Xenoanthropologists were filing requests to study the footage. Several universities wanted to offer David guest lectures after the competition ended. David nodded politely and said he was just doing what felt natural. The coordinator's translator made a sound like choking. That evening, David sat on his porch eating a meal of fish stew with wild vegetables and herbs he had identified. He had even fermented some fruit into a mildly alcoholic drink. Though he rationed it carefully, the sunset was beautiful, and his fire crackled pleasantly in its stone-lined pit. 15 days in, and David was not just surviving. He had running water via his bamboo pipe system. He had furniture, dishes, preserved food, clean clothes, and a proper bed. He bathed regularly. He ate varied meals. His shelter was weatherproof and comfortable. The wilderness had not been tamed exactly. It was still wild, still dangerous in its way. But David had carved out a space within it where humanity could exist comfortably. That was the key, not dominating nature, but creating a pocket of civilization within it. David raised his cup toward the nearest camera drone in a mock toast. To the viewers out there, this might look easy now. They did not see the planning, the careful observation, the accumulated knowledge of human survival techniques refined over millennia. They just saw the result, a human living comfortably where others struggled. The stars emerged overhead and David finished his meal. 15 days down, 15 to go. He wondered what else he could build in that time. A proper oven, maybe. Better tools. Perhaps even some form of entertainment. Life was not just about meeting needs. It was about enjoying the meeting of those needs. David cleaned his dishes, banked his fire, and retired to his shelter. Through the window, he could see the river glittering under starlight. Tomorrow he would start on that oven. After all, a man could only eat smoked and boiled food for so long before wanting something baked. The oven was David's masterpiece. He spent 3 full days on it, building it from stone and clay near his main shelter. The design was simple but effective, a domed chamber with a flat floor for cooking and an opening at the front with a chimney at the back. He fired it empty first, slowly increasing the heat over hours to prevent cracking. The clay hardened into something resembling ceramic, and the stones held their positions perfectly. On day 19, David baked his first bread. Well, bread was a generous term. It was flatbread made from ground seeds and tubers mixed with water, but it was baked rather than boiled or fried. The smell wafting from his oven made even David nostalgic for home. The taste was bland, but the texture was wonderful. and it represented something important: comfort food. The camera drones hovered closer than usual, capturing every moment. David had learned to ignore them mostly, but he had also started to understand their patterns. When he did something particularly unusual, they moved in for better angles. The oven definitely qualified as unusual. Day 20 brought another check-in. Gorvin barely looked at the display, his eyes half closed with exhaustion. The Srath had been fighting the environment for 3 weeks instead of working with it, and it showed. His scales were scratched and dull. His movements were slow. When he saw David's camp through the shared display, including the oven with bread cooling on a stone, something in him broke. Gorvin asked, in a voice that sounded nothing like his earlier boasting, if David would share his methods. There was no pride left in the question, just desperation and genuine curiosity. David spent the next 10 minutes explaining basic principles: conserve energy, build infrastructure, think long-term. Gorvin listened with an intensity that suggested he was actually hearing it this time. Moss had a different reaction. The Droon hunter looked at David's setup and started laughing, that burbling chortle that sounded like water through pipes. He admitted freely that he had underestimated human ingenuity. Droon were ambush predators by nature, patient and observant, but they had never developed the human drive to modify their environment so extensively. Moss asked if he could visit David's camp, not to beg for help but to see it in person. David agreed. The rules said nothing about visitors. Moss arrived the next morning, moving on his 4 legs with surprising grace despite his fatigue. His amphibious skin had dried out in places, creating rough patches. He needed humidity more than the planet naturally provided. David showed him around the camp, explaining each element. Moss was particularly interested in the water collection system and the pottery. They shared lunch, David serving baked fish with roasted vegetables and that rough flatbread. Moss ate slowly, savoring each bite. Through his translator, he said something that David found touching. Food prepared with care tasted better than food grabbed in desperation, even if the ingredients were identical. It was about the context, the moment of peace in which it was consumed. After Moss left, David continued his improvements. He extended his porch, creating more covered space. He built a proper deck overlooking the river, complete with a seating area. The view was genuinely beautiful, especially at sunset, and David found himself spending evenings there simply watching the water flow. Day 22 marked another milestone: the shower. David had been bathing in his solar-heated basin, but he wanted better. He built a raised platform with a bamboo floor that allowed drainage. Above it, he positioned a large pottery vessel, filled through his water collection system. He added a simple plug that could be pulled to release water. It was not hot water, though he could warm some in his oven and mix it in. It was not perfect pressure, but it was a shower and it was glorious. The galactic audience went wild. The viewership numbers during his shower installation were reportedly higher than some planetary elections. Commentators across species lines debated human psychology. Why did they need so much comfort? Why could they not simply endure? But others, particularly the younger generation of various species, saw something different. They saw someone refusing to let circumstances dictate quality of life. They saw intelligence applied not just to survival, but to living well. Prism finally spoke during the Day 24 check-in. Her crystalline form had deteriorated noticeably, stress fractures spreading across her surface. But her translated voice was thoughtful rather than defeated. She admitted that Loomis had focused so heavily on intellectual advancement that they had neglected practical skills. Watching David had taught her something valuable. Intelligence included the wisdom to maintain one's well-being even in hardship. She asked if David could explain his planning process. How did he decide what to build and when? David thought about it before answering. He explained that he worked in layers: immediate needs first, then efficiency improvements, then comfort, then refinement. Each layer built on the previous one. You could not have a shower if you did not first have reliable water. You could not have an oven if you did not first have fire and shelter. Prism's surface pulsed with light. She said that matched how Loomis approached intellectual problems: foundational knowledge, then application, then optimization, then innovation. Perhaps species were not as different in their thinking as they appeared. They just applied those patterns to different domains. After the check-in, David worked on his latest project, a musical instrument. He had spotted hollow logs that resonated nicely when struck. With careful cutting and tuning, he created something resembling a xylophone. The notes were not perfect, but they were pleasant. That evening, he sat on his deck and played simple melodies, making up tunes as he went. The cameras captured it all. A human alone on an alien world, playing music for no reason except that music made life better. It was perhaps the most human thing David had done yet. Day 25 brought an unexpected development. All three of his previous visitors, Rithan, Moss, and even Gorvin, appeared at his camp within hours of each other. They had not coordinated, but they had all reached the same conclusion. They wanted to see what David had built now. David welcomed them all. His camp could accommodate visitors after all. He had seating, he had food to share, and honestly, he had missed conversation. 3 weeks of solitude had been peaceful but isolating. Gorvin looked humbled, a stark contrast to his earlier arrogance. He examined everything with careful attention, asking questions about techniques and materials. He admitted that Srath culture valued individual strength so highly that they often overlooked the strength found in preparation and planning. The four of them sat together on David's deck that evening, sharing a meal he had prepared. 4 different species evolved on 4 different worlds, brought together by a survival challenge and the realization that survival meant different things to different beings. David served his best effort yet. Baked fish seasoned with herbs, roasted root vegetables, flatbread, and even a small portion of fermented fruit drink for each of them. They ate slowly, talking through translators about their worlds, their cultures, and what they had learned. Moss said something profound through his bubbling speech. Humans did not just survive environments, they domesticated them. Not through dominance, but through understanding and adaptation. It was a different kind of strength. As the alien stars emerged overhead and David's fire crackled in its stone pit, the 4 competitors sat together in comfortable silence. The cameras recorded it all, and across the galaxy beings watched and wondered. Somewhere in the galactic network discussions raged. Was this still a survival competition? Had David changed the nature of the challenge? Did his approach count as cheating or as genius? But on planet Tau 7, in a camp that had become more resort than wilderness shelter, 4 beings simply enjoyed a moment of peace together, and perhaps that was the real lesson. Survival was not just about making it to the end. It was about maintaining who you were along the way. Day 26 started like any other. David woke with the sunrise, stretched on his comfortable sleeping platform, and went through his morning routine. Water from his collection system, a wash in his basin, breakfast of leftover fish and flatbread. He was planning to work on expanding his garden when the emergency alert came through. Every competitor's communication device activated simultaneously, the ones they had surrendered except for emergencies. The coordinator's voice came through urgent and clear. Massive wildfire detected in the northern zones. Lightning strike during the night had started it. Wind was pushing it south. Gorvin and Prism were in immediate danger. All competitors were to evacuate to the southern safe zone immediately. David grabbed his knife and emergency beacon out of habit, then stopped. The southern safe zone was just the area near his camp. The river formed a natural fire break. The others were being evacuated to him. Within 2 hours they arrived. First came Rithan, moving fast on her 6 legs, carrying nothing but her basic supplies. Then Moss, his skin dark with stress. Prism appeared next, being half-carried by a rescue drone because she could not move quickly. Finally, Gorvin stumbled in, coughing from smoke inhalation. The northern zones were already burning. David's camp, built for 1 human, suddenly housed 5 beings with completely different needs. This was the real test. He acted without hesitation, falling into patterns learned from years of wilderness emergency response training. First priority, assess everyone's condition. Gorvin needed his breathing checked and his airways cleared of smoke residue. Prism's cracks had worsened from the stress and heat of fleeing. Moss was dehydrated. Rethan was physically fine but clearly shaken. David got them all water first, clean and filtered. Then he assessed his resources. Food was not an immediate problem. He had preserved supplies. Shelter was the challenge. His main structure could fit maybe 2 beings, and that was crowded. The porch helped, but they needed more. He organized them quickly. Rithan and Moss had the most physical capability despite their exhaustion. He set them to gathering bamboo poles while he used his axe to cut larger support beams. Gorvin was to rest and recover his breathing. Prism he positioned in the shade, giving her water regularly to cool her crystalline structure. They worked through the afternoon, building an extension to David's shelter. It was rough work, nowhere near his usual standards, but it was functional. By evening, they had a covered space large enough for everyone to sleep under protection. David showed them how to lash poles together properly, how to angle supports for maximum strength, how to create a roof that would shed rain. The second night brought rain, heavy and cold. David's extended shelter held. Water ran off the angled roof as designed. Inside, 5 beings from 5 worlds huddled together, dry and relatively safe. David's fire pit, positioned to serve the expanded area, provided warmth. He cooked a meal large enough for everyone, rationing his preserved supplies carefully. Day 27 presented a new challenge: living together. 5 species meant 5 different needs. Moss needed regular moisture, so David created a humid section using wet moss and frequent water spraying. Prism needed exposure to light for energy, so she got the spot with the best sun access. Gorvin needed protein more than the others, his reptilian metabolism demanding it. Rithan could eat almost anything but preferred her food raw. David coordinated everything. He assigned tasks based on ability. Gorvin, recovering now, was the strongest. He hauled large logs and stones. Rithan's multiple limbs made her excellent at weaving and construction. Moss's hunting skills, better than David's, provided fresh meat. Prism, limited physically, became the planner. Her crystalline mind could hold and process complex information. She tracked their resources and calculated consumption rates. The camp transformed again. What had been a one-person resort became a multi-species refuge. David taught them his techniques. Gorvin learned to build furniture, his powerful hands becoming surprisingly deft. Rithan took to pottery, her precision creating better vessels than David had managed. Moss improved the fish traps, making them more efficient. But the real challenge was not physical. It was social. 5 beings, 5 cultures, 5 completely different worldviews sharing limited space under stress. Arguments erupted on day 28. Gorvin, frustrated by his earlier failures, snapped at Rithan over some minor issue about fire tending. Rithan responded with clicking insults in her own language. Moss tried to mediate, but his bubbling speech was hard to understand when rapid. Prism withdrew into silence. The tension threatened to tear apart everything they had built. David let them argue for 10 minutes. Then he stood, walked to his musical instrument, and started playing. Not loudly, not aggressively, just simple notes. One by one, they quieted and looked at him. He spoke calmly. They were all tired. They were all stressed. They had all faced possible death from the fire. They were all dealing with wounded pride from needing rescue. But they were also all alive. They were fed. They were sheltered. They were safe. Fighting among themselves helped nothing. He suggested something radical. Each of them should teach the others something from their own culture. Not survival skills, but something personal. Music, stories, games, art. Something that reminded them they were people, not just survivors. Gorvin went first, surprisingly. He taught them a Srath breathing exercise used by warriors to control fear and pain. The slow rhythmic breathing helped everyone calm down. Rithan showed them a pattern weaving game her people played, creating complex designs with plant fibers. It required focus and cooperation. Moss told them a story from Droon oral tradition, about the first hunter who learned patience. The translators struggled with some of the poetic language, but the meaning came through. Prism, when her turn came, created light patterns in her crystalline body, a form of art that Loomis used to express emotion. It was beautiful and alien and deeply moving. David played more music, teaching them simple rhythms they could tap along to. It was not sophisticated, but it was together. That evening, they sat around the expanded fire pit, 5 species creating something like harmony. Day 29 brought word that the fire was contained. The northern zones were devastated, but the situation was stable. They could return to their original areas tomorrow if they wished. The competition could continue. Nobody moved to leave. Instead, they worked together on one final project, completing the camp's transformation. Gorvin used his strength to move large stones, creating a proper courtyard. Rythan wove decorative elements, making the space beautiful as well as functional. Moss improved the riverside area, creating better fishing spots. Prism calculated optimal positions for water collection and sun exposure. David coordinated it all, but he was not in charge anymore. They were working as a team, each contributing their strengths. The human had started this, but they all owned it now. That night, their last night together before the competition ended, they prepared a feast. Everyone contributed something. Gorvin caught a large animal. Rethan gathered the best vegetables. Moss prepared a special dish using river plants. Prism used her light patterns to create ambiance. David cooked it all in his oven and over his fire, creating a meal that somehow worked despite the mismatched ingredients. They ate together under the stars. On a planet none of them called home, in a camp that had been built by human hands but was now something more. It was proof that different beings could not just coexist but thrive together when they pooled their knowledge and abilities. The cameras captured everything. Across the galaxy, beings watched 5 competitors who should have been rivals acting like a community. The footage was already being analyzed by sociologists and diplomats. This competition had stopped being about individual survival and had become something unprecedented, a demonstration of interspecies cooperation. Tomorrow was day 30. Tomorrow the challenge would officially end. But tonight they were not competitors. They were simply people who had survived together and become something like friends in the process. Dawn on day 30 arrived with clear skies and cool air. David woke to find his 4 companions already awake, sitting together by the fire pit drinking water from pottery cups they had made together. The sunrise painted the river gold, and for a moment everything was peaceful. The coordinator arrived at midday for the final evaluation. The floating jellyfish creature materialized above the camp, its tentacles curling in what might have been shock. It had visited each zone separately over the past month, documenting progress. But this was different. This was all 5 competitors together in a camp that looked less like a survival shelter and more like a small village. The coordinator floated slowly through the area, its sensors taking in everything. The main shelter with its extension, the oven, the pottery workshop, the smoking racks, the garden plot, the riverside bathing and fishing area, the courtyard, the furniture, the musical instrument, the decorative weavings, the organized storage areas, the water collection system, the waste management zone positioned downstream and away from living areas. Through its translator, the coordinator made a sound that might have been laughter or despair. It asked a simple question. What exactly had happened here? David let the others answer. Gorvin spoke about learning that strength included the strength to build and plan, not just to fight and endure. Rethan talked about discovering that cooperation could achieve what individual effort could not. Moss described understanding that patience could be applied to construction as well as hunting. Prism explained that intelligence had many applications, and creating comfort was as valid as solving abstract problems. David added only that he had tried to maintain his humanity in difficult circumstances, and that meant living well, not just staying alive. The others had each brought their own strengths to that goal, making it possible to achieve more together than any could alone. The coordinator processed this for a long moment. Then it announced that the evaluation team would arrive shortly to make official judgments. In the meantime, all 5 competitors were confirmed to have survived the 30 days. Technically, that meant they all passed. The evaluation team arrived an hour later. Representatives from the Galactic Council, survival experts from a dozen species, and media drones carrying live feeds to billions of viewers. They walked through the camp in silence, examining everything. They tested the structures, sampled the food, reviewed the water system, and studied the layout. The lead evaluator, a dignified being covered in feathers with 4 eyes, finally spoke. This was unprecedented. The competition was designed to test individual survival capabilities in hostile conditions. What they found here was a thriving community in a successfully modified environment. It raised questions about the nature of the test itself. One of the other evaluators, a rock-like being with a gravelly voice, pointed out that nothing in the rules prohibited what had occurred. Each competitor had used only natural materials and tools they created themselves. No outside help had been given beyond the initial supplies. The emergency evacuation had been initiated by the organizers, not the competitors. Everything else had been the competitors' choice. A debate erupted among the evaluators. Some argued this violated the spirit of the competition. Others maintained it perfectly captured the competition's goal, surviving 30 days using adaptability and intelligence. Still others suggested this transcended the original purpose and demonstrated something more valuable. While the evaluators argued, David and his companions sat at their table, sharing what remained of their food stores. They ignored the debate. Whatever the official verdict, they knew what they had accomplished. They had not just survived, they had lived. They had maintained their dignity, their cultures, their identities. They had shown that cooperation across species lines was possible even in difficult circumstances. The head evaluator finally called for order. After consultation with the Galactic Council, a decision had been reached. All 5 competitors had successfully survived 30 days and would be marked as passing the challenge. However, the human David Walsh would receive special recognition for environmental adaptation and resource optimization. Additionally, a new category would be created for future competitions: collaborative survival, recognizing that some species' greatest strength might lie in community building rather than individual endurance. The announcement was met with mixed reactions across the galaxy. Some traditionalists complained that the competition had been compromised. Others celebrated the new perspective. But the viewership numbers spoke clearly. This had been the most watched survival challenge in galactic history, with the final evaluation reaching nearly 1 trillion viewers across hundreds of worlds. The competitors were transported back to the staging area for closing ceremonies. David took one last look at the camp before leaving. It would be preserved as a historical site, the organizers had decided. Future competitors and visitors could see what had been built here. David felt oddly proud of that. This place had started as wilderness and had become briefly a home. The closing ceremony was elaborate. Each competitor received recognition for their efforts. Gorvin was praised for his determination and eventual adaptability, Rithan for her quick thinking and construction skills, Moss for his hunting expertise and emotional intelligence, Prism for her analytical abilities and willingness to learn practical skills. When David's name was called, the crowd's reaction was complex. Applause certainly, but also something like awe. The human had not just won a competition. He had changed how species across the galaxy thought about survival, adaptation, and the relationship between beings and their environment. David's speech was short. He thanked his fellow competitors who had taught him as much as he had taught them. He explained that humans did not see survival and comfort as opposing concepts. Creating a pleasant life was not weakness or cheating. It was the application of intelligence to improve circumstances. Every species had strengths. Human strength was not physical superiority or natural armaments. It was the ability to look at any environment and ask, how can I make this better? After the ceremony, David was approached by dozens of representatives. Universities wanted him to lecture. Colonies wanted him as a consultant. Media outlets wanted interviews. Anthropologists wanted to study human psychology. David politely accepted some offers and declined others. He was not interested in fame. He had entered the competition to challenge himself and had found something more valuable: friends from other worlds and proof that different beings could work together. 3 months later, David stood in a lecture hall on a space station orbiting a planet he had never heard of before the competition. The room was filled with beings from across the galaxy, all eager to hear about human survival techniques. But David did not just talk about building shelters or finding food. He talked about maintaining identity, about the importance of comfort and beauty even in difficulty, about cooperation and shared knowledge. In the audience sat Gorvin, Rithan, Moss, and Prism. They had stayed in contact after the competition, visiting each other's worlds and learning about each other's cultures. They had become something rare in the galaxy, genuine friends across species lines. And they had all become advocates for a new approach to wilderness challenges, one that valued adaptation and cooperation as much as endurance. The camp on planet Tau 7 did become a tourist destination. Beings from hundreds of worlds visited to see the place where a human had turned wilderness into a resort, where 5 species had learned to live together, where a survival competition had become a demonstration of community. Some visitors were disappointed that it looked so simple, just wood and stone and clay, nothing high-tech or impressive by galactic standards. But others understood. They saw not what the materials were, but what they represented. Every piece of pottery was a choice to have better storage. Every section of furniture was a refusal to accept discomfort as inevitable. Every decorative element was an assertion that beauty mattered even in hard times. And the camp's layout, designed to accommodate 5 different species' needs, was proof that with intelligence and effort, different beings could share space peacefully. David eventually wrote a book about his experience. It was not a technical manual, though it included practical information. It was more of a philosophy book, exploring what it meant to survive, to live, and to remain fully yourself even when circumstances tried to reduce you to mere existence. The book became required reading in some educational systems and was banned in others that found its messages about adaptability threatening to traditional values. Years later, when asked what he was most proud of from the competition, David did not mention the win or the fame or the friendships, though those all mattered. He said he was proud that he had proven a point. Humans did not conquer nature through domination or by becoming something other than human. They did it by bringing humanity with them wherever they went. Fire, shelter, art, music, community, comfort. These were not luxuries to be abandoned in hard times. They were essentials that defined what being human meant. The camera footage from those 30 days was archived in the Galactic Library, available for anyone to study. And sometimes when beings from various worlds faced their own challenges, they remembered the human who had turned wilderness into a home. They remembered that surviving was necessary, but living well was the real victory. They remembered that intelligence could be applied to comfort as well as conquest, to building as well as enduring. And across the galaxy, in small ways and large, beings began to think differently about the relationship between themselves and their environments. Not every species adopted human methods, but many began to ask themselves a very human question: how can we make this better? That perhaps was David Walsh's true legacy. Not the camp or the competition or the fame, but the idea, spreading slowly across the stars, that anyone could transform their circumstances with enough creativity, effort, and refusal to accept that suffering was necessary. The idea that thriving was not just for the lucky or the powerful, but for anyone willing to work for it. And somewhere on Earth, in the mountains where David had first learned survival skills as a child, a new generation of humans learned those same techniques, carrying forward a tradition thousands of years old. Building fires, creating shelters, finding food and water, but also creating beauty, maintaining dignity, and refusing to let hard circumstances diminish their humanity. Because that was what humans did. They survived, and then they did something more. They lived.